So I guess Stan and I were in sync this morning, because not only do I think my lesson kind of goes along with what he was talking about, some similar concepts, but also I had two different plans for my scripture reading, and the plan I didn't go with was actually Deuteronomy 32. So could have led into that, I guess, a little better if I would have gone with the other train of thought, but. I want to talk today about the idea of blessings and curses, and I want to look at it from a couple different comparisons and perspectives. And last week, when I was preparing to do the talk before the Lord's Supper, I at one point had thought I was going to do this talk about curses, and then I thought, Christmas morning, I don't know if people are going to be feeling a curses lesson, so. Maybe we'll push that off. But I want to talk about a couple of ideas. So oftentimes in our life and in the Bible and in different situations, we see, two opposite sides of things. And so blessings and curses would fall into that. And I want to look at that along with two other of these pairs. The first one is the pair of order and chaos, and the other is life and death. And look at how these kind of tie together. So, starting with chaos, I don't know, anybody who played Sonic like I did growing up, you had to get the Chaos Emerald. Sonic was a master of chaos. But chaos typically is not something that we celebrate unless you're playing Sonic. It's a challenge. And I'm not going to get into the science on this because it's been a long time. I don't know if I really understand it. But there's something called entropy. And it's been explained kind of as the idea that things tend toward chaos or toward disorder. And the example that I remember they gave us in probably our middle school science class is they said, just think about a child's room at your house. What happens if you don't monitor it? I mean, I think, I never was great at keeping things in order. I have a sibling here who was much worse than me. And... left unchecked, that room would become pretty chaotic. It takes a lot of effort to neatly organize, to put things in drawers and in their space. And, that takes effort. It doesn't take effort to fling things everywhere. Somebody else who's in the audience further a row or two back, I remember I was over at their house and he decided to have fun. He just wanted to dump out all his toys. Again, pretty easy to create chaos. And so in general, the idea is that our world tends toward chaos. And I'm not going to get into this because scientifically, I don't know this well enough. But that's one of those things that's always kind of given me the idea or a confirmation of a creator and of a caring creator. Because otherwise, if the world is tending toward chaos, life isn't going to survive. So it took something that overcomes that chaos. But I want to look, if you look in the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, we see chaos at the start. We see this disorder. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So we see this picture here of a formless void of an earth. And so again, if you're looking at order is formed. It's very specific. So the opposite of that, a formless. And we see this chaos. We see darkness. You think about, you don't know what's happening in darkness. You can't tell. You can't see. And then the idea of it was the waters, these expanses, these seas. There was no land. There was nothing that separated it. Think about just the middle of the ocean. You've got storms raging. You've got the waters just go crazy. It's a chaotic place. It's a place that on its own... look at this picture. This formless, voidless, landless, lightless place. Is any creature going to survive in that environment? That's not a place that survival is going to thrive. But God brings order out of the chaos. What does God create? God says, let there be light. We see God bringing this order, bringing light, bringing this visibility. A little bit later, we see he says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let's separate waters from waters. And then later he says, let's gather the waters together, gather the land out of the waters. He made dry land appear. So he took this chaotic state and he ordered it. He brought order out of chaos. The world itself wasn't going to bring this order. That's not what entropy or the chaos or the idea of chaos would lend us to. Instead, it took something who had more power than this chaos, than this world. And so we see God in his nature is a God of order. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, it talks about how the assembly should go. And it talks about God is not a God of disorder or confusion, I think some verses, some translations say. Chaos, essentially, is the idea. He's not a God of chaos, but instead, he's a God of peace. And I think along with that, we would say a God of order. We're looking at the opposite. So, by nature, God brings order. Also, in the first chapter of Genesis, we see blessings. Now, I think you could argue that this order he's created here would be a blessing, but we see the specific idea of God blessing. And if you remember, what does God bless? God blesses two things. He blesses basically the creatures, and then he blesses man with a blessing even greater than the creatures. But do you remember what his blessing is? If you thinking back, what did he bless them? He said he blessed them to multiply. He blessed them to expand. And so it's kind of interesting, the idea of be fruitful and multiply. Life is what God provided. But in a sense, God gave the blessing of creating life to his creation. How does life come? Well, he allows the animals to reproduce, to multiply, to create life. Now, obviously, he was the initial source of that life, but he gives that blessing of life. And then to mankind, he says, be fruitful and multiply. And then on top of that, he says, you have dominion over these other creatures. So again, the idea, this blessing of life. Well, as Logan talked about last week, as Stan referenced, the Bible essentially, this is the goal. This is the ideal. Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 is the ideal goal of God in a relationship with man, a perfect relationship. I've mentioned this before, but one of my teachers, if it weren't for Genesis 3, the Bible would have ended at Genesis 2. And obviously, again, kind of a silly statement, but the idea is there wouldn't have been a need for anything else. Nothing else that's in the Bible would have been necessary if Genesis 2, if Genesis 3 didn't happen, right? Man would have been in that perfect relationship with God as they were in the garden. And so Genesis 3 is where the idea of the curse comes in. And again, the opposite of blessing would be the curse. And it's interesting what specifically is mentioned as being cursed. He curses the serpent and he curses the ground. I think, again, we can take it that man receives a curse here, the curse of that he will surely die. That curse is, God shows some mercy over that curse. He doesn't immediately strike man dead. But do you remember thinking back what the trouble was, what the sin that mankind did was in Genesis chapter 3? And again, people think, well, they took the fruit, they ate of the tree that they weren't supposed to. They were disobedient to God. And I think that's the key, but think about what the goal was. What were they trying to achieve when they partook of this? And what did they achieve? They took of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And essentially, excuse me, I think what you can think of there is God had given them a perfect plan. God had given them a perfect situation. God had given them perfect knowledge. But they decided, well, we want our own knowledge. There's this that's good to make us wise. And they decided, you know what? God has his plan, but I'm going to do things my way. My plan is what I'm going to test out. And so sin, essentially, their sin was breaking the divine, the godly commandment, and taking knowledge into their own hands. Basically, in a way, taking their fate or their destiny into their own hands. And I'm going to take myself where I want to go. And essentially, God allowed that to happen. That's kind of what the punishment was. Is instead of God protecting them and using His wisdom toward their plan, He allowed them to carry out their own plan. He allowed them to do things their own way. And I think as we look at this, I want to look at how essentially man is cursed when they decide that their way is better than God's way. If you decide that the way you want to do something is better than the way God tells you to do it, then you'll be cursed by that. And think about what that curse is. And I think it's a little bit ironic. The curse is essentially God lets that happen. God removes His protection, removes you out of His perfect plan, and allows you to go your own way, go into the way that is destructive, to go back into that chaos, to essentially live in a land where you are rejecting the order that God has brought. And so that will push us toward death. If we reject God's order, if we reject God's overcoming chaos and go our own way, we are sucked into that chaos, that disorder that leads to death. And so, think about it. I think it even makes sense. He curses the ground. He mentions cursing the ground. That was one of the things that God had set in order for mankind. Mankind needed the ground, needed the land to be able to live, needed the vegetation. Well, now God says, I'm going to let that go toward disorder. And again, think about the concept. If you've ever had a field and you just kind of let that field go, what's it end up like? We've got a hill on our backyard that's just a pain. You can't really mow it. But if I just let it go, well, these weeds and these thorns spring up out of it, and it takes an effort. That's essentially, in a very rough sense, that's what the curse is, God allowing that back in. On a larger scale, think about a farm. If a farm no one treats it, no one does anything with it, what's it going to end up with after a while? It's going to be, useless, essentially, without a lot of effort going in to bring that order back. And the idea, again, I mentioned that essentially God is withholding His order or His protection. That's an idea that we see throughout the Bible. Lamentations chapter 2, verse 3, it says, God has withdrawn His right hand. You think about His right hand is essentially over you, protecting you. After their sin, He had withdrawn His right hand. He didn't have to actively punish them. By God removing His protection and allowing man to experience his own fate, that's the punishment that all that's needed. Again, if we won't spend a lot of time here, but I think maybe the most detailed verse on this or section on this is in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, it says, essentially, verse 18 through the end of the chapter, there, verse 32, these are people who should have known who God was, but they claimed to be wise. They ignored God's wisdom and said, we've got our own wisdom, we're going to do our own thing. And 3 times, I think, maybe more, but at least 3 times it says God gave them over to their whatever they wanted to do. He said, all right, I'm giving you over to that. And again, we see the results of that lead to death, lead to their destruction. Again, it's essentially the opposite of what we see in James chapter 1. Verse 17, it says, every good gift comes from God. What is good comes from God. It also references that He brought forth by the word the first fruits of His creatures. So kind of the Christians are brought back and referenced into that initial creation, that perfect creation. They're brought back into that. God has brought the order to them. So I know that was a lot of just kind of ideas and thoughts. I want to spend a little while in Deuteronomy, and I'm going to jump just ahead of Stan. We're going to go back to We'll reference chapter 27, look mostly in 28 and a little in 30. And look at just kind of some of these concepts we see about this is where the blessings and the curses really are focused. And there's a significant focus in Moses' speech here toward them about the blessings and the curses. In chapter 27, he sends them up and he references on Mount Ebal the curses, cursed here, cursed be anyone who does this. Again, we won't get into all the details if you want to read it. But I want to look at the start of verse 28 and then kind of in the middle of the chapter 28, at the blessings and the curses and the contrast, and look at what this draws your mind back to. Chapter 28, verse 1 of Deuteronomy. If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. So again, this goes right back to what we talked about. If we do things God's way, God will bring that order. And he goes on, all these blessings, verse 2, shall come upon you and overtake you. If you obey the voice of the Lord your God, blessed you shall be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, and the fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your cattle, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. Does that not draw our mind back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2? Look at what he's blessing. He's blessing the fruit of their womb. Be fruitful and multiply. You know, what's the part of the curse or part of the punishment towards sin is the pain in childbirth that the woman would have. You know, here he's going back and he's blessing them in that procreation, in that multiplication, and that spreading. He talks about blessed shall be the fruit of the ground. Again, this ground that he's perfectly set up. What was broken in chapter 3? We see, well, the ground was cursed. But if they are obedient, if they're willing to go back to God, he will bring back that blessing. Bless their cattle, bless their animals, their herds. So, again, I think we see this picture here of God's goal, kind of like what Logan talked about last week. It was to bring them back into this relationship. And this is one of the ways that that's done. And converse to that, verse 15, but if they will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all the commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb and the fruit of the ground, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. And the verse 20, I think, is interesting. The Lord will send on you curses, confusion, and frustration in all that you undertake to do, until you are destroyed and perish quickly on account of the evil of your deeds, because you've forsaken me. Again, that we see both the references back here, I think, again, to the creation, to Genesis 1 and 2, and then 3 also with the curses. But then this idea that he'll send the curses of confusion and frustration, of chaos, of disorder. He'll send you back to before you could live, before God brought the order that allowed life. And what's that going to lead to? That's going to lead to your destruction, your perishing. You go your own way. You decide, well, I'm going to do it my way. My way is better than God's way. Again, he's going to let you go back he's going to let himself leave your life. He's going to let you do things without him if you decide that's what you want. And you see, the result of that is a world where you can't live. Again, not to make this a creation or any type of debate like that, but the idea of this is essentially, without God, I kind of think Darwin would be right. It would be survival of the fittest, but the issue is that no one would be fit enough to survive, right? No one could overcome that chaos without God. So that's essentially where he's sending you to. If you decide, I don't want to be with God, I don't want to go his way, he says, all right, I'll let you go your own way. Now, again, as Stan pointed out, he's willing to let you come back. We've seen up to this point, they have been disobedient consistently. He's wanting them to come back. He's saying these blessings are still available. These blessings are still available to you if you will obey. But he's not forcing it. He is allowing us to make the decision of if we're going to follow him or we're going to go our own way. There's a lot in chapter 28 if you ever want to be knocked back on track, just read through chapter 28 and read through these curses, and that might set you straight. That might straighten you out a little bit if you're drifting off a little bit. But I want to look at a couple ideas here toward the end of this chapter. And again, there's a lot in here we'll skip over. But let's go ahead and look at verse 64 toward the end. It says, "And the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. And among these nations you shall find no respite, and there shall be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But the Lord will give you a trembling heart and failing eyes and a languishing soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you." And we won't go on to the rest of it. But we see here the idea of those who are disobedient to God, who serve other gods. Essentially, God says, all right, I'll leave you in the hands of those gods. See what those gods will do for you. Again, this is the concept in the prophets, in Isaiah. This comes up quite often. Look at what value is it that these other gods can bring. If you want to serve the other gods, God says, all right, let them protect you. But what's the result going to be? There's going to be no respite. There's going to be no resting place. There's going to be terror and trembling all the day because God is removing that protection from over you. Again, we'll skip over. I've probably used this verse about as much as any in chapter 30. And there's a lot here. We won't read all of it. But in chapter 30, starting in verse 11, he says, "For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea," again, beyond the chaos, "that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can do it." So again, he says, this is here for you. This is right here. It's not something that is out of reach. It's not something that is out of your grasp. Verse 15, "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I commanded you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it." Again, it's all tied up together right here. If you obey him, he will provide that life, that order, that blessing that he can give. But, verse 17, "If your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land of the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them." Again, very clearly plain out. If someone asks you what a blessing is life. That's the blessing. What's the curse? Well, the curse is death, essentially. In a broad standpoint, sure, you can look at there are smaller blessings, there may be smaller curses, but essentially, in general, the blessing of God is life, and the curse of God is removing that protection, removing that order, which allows you to go toward the chaos, toward destruction, and toward death. I want to look a little bit, just to close, at the concept of the afterlife, of heaven versus hell, of God's protection and God's presence. And I remember at some point, I'd heard it mentioned that essentially hell is the absence of God. And just hearing that statement, some people might think, well, that's not that bad. We like to think, well, if there's not good, but there's not bad, just things are neutral. Well, that's fine. It's not the best, but I'm okay to just coast along. But I think that takes away the idea, the recognition, what we talked about in James, that every good thing comes from God. It takes away the idea that without God, things do tend toward chaos. Things do tend toward destruction, toward death. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, we see this concept played out very clearly. We'll look at this, and we'll look at one more verse after this. But in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9, and again, we're just jumping in the middle here, but essentially he says, they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of God and from the glory of his might. Away from the presence of God is an everlasting or an eternal destruction. You know, if you don't have God, you don't have his protection. You don't have his care, and you're just moving toward destruction, an everlasting destruction, which I can't even really fathom. But if you want to turn to the end of Revelation, we can see the other option. And again, this really ties in with that concept of God bringing us back to what we saw in Genesis 1 and 2. In Revelation 22, the last chapter of the Bible, verse 1, it says, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the streets of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Excuse me. So again, we clearly see here language that directly ties us back to the garden. Verse 3, no longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. No more curse. The curse is over at this stage. At the end, those who are in everlasting life are with God in his presence, and there's going to be no curse because his protection is with you. He is over you. Continue on. They will see his face, that's verse 4, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. That chaos that was at the beginning, night will be no more. They will have no need of light or of a lamp or sun, for the Lord will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. So not only is this taking away the chaos, taking away the curse, taking away the death, but this is even greater, an even greater creation than the initial one. The initial one, God put representative lights. He gave a sun to light the way. He gave the stars. Here there's not a need for that because there's the even greater light of God himself. And so, again, the idea is presented to us. And I just thought about this, kind of reading through the curses and just, people might ask, well, if God is a loving God, how does he cause these what we might call terrible things to happen? And essentially, I think we can point out that if we reject God, then he doesn't have to cause terrible things to happen. The world is chaotic. If he just removes his protection from us, then we've got all the trouble that we can handle and more. And so the idea that there's essentially two ways to go. What's the phrase? My way or the highway? There's God's way or the highway that leads to destruction. There's the blessings and the curses. There's life and death. So if you ever need a reminder of being blessed by God, just think about what the alternative. Think about when God isn't there. Think about the worst you can imagine of essentially being alone with no hope, no help, no comfort. Or you can have the comfort, or you can have the ultimate comfort. You can have the ultimate protection in God. And we have that opportunity to be brought back into that relationship with him thanks to Christ Jesus. Thanks to the Savior, the Anointed One. Thanks to God who came from heaven and took the place of our sin so that we could stay in the ordered, blessed, life-filled relationship with God. If there's anyone who needs to enter into that, we talked a little bit in class about how we can enter that through water, this relationship through water and the Spirit. We have water that we can enter that in, or if there's any other way we can help you, there's anything we can do, just please let us know. We're going to conclude with an invitation song.